Welcome everybody. I'll just introduce our speaker, although she doesn't require an introduction, but still. So Professor Sonalde Desai is a professor at NCAR with joint appointment as a professor of sociology at University of Maryland. She directs the NCAR National Data Innovation Center. It's established by NCAR with its consortium partners, University of Maryland and University of Michigan. She is an internationally known demographer whose work deals primarily with human development in developing countries, with a particular focus on gender and class inequalities. While most of her research is focused on India, she has taken comparative studies across South Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Ma'am is also leading the IHDS survey, that is the Indian Human Development Survey. That's the only panel study that we have had, and it has had data for 2004, 5, 11, 12. And the next wave, I think, is planned around 2019-20, so it must have been conducted. Professor Sonal also has published articles in a wide range of international sociology and demography journals, and she's a frequent contributor to the Hindi.
So let me before Fiona starts, let's also add with your permission that what would also be very inspiring for our group is that she's currently the president-elect of the prestigious Population Association of America, and she is probably the only person from the global South and South Asia to be the president of the population, and probably the only non-American to be at the president of the Population Association of America. And over to you, Sonal.
Thank you. I'll just tell you, Varsha, I wish we had finished the IHDS 3. Unfortunately, the pandemic struck and we are now waiting for things to get a little bit better before we can go into the field. Okay, and it's going to be a sort of a strange thing to be doing a panel study right after such a major catastrophe has sort of struck the nation. Okay, yeah. But let me start sharing my screen with you. 1 minute. But Varsha and Arun, please let me know if the screen freezes, because sometimes my screen tends to freeze. And if it happens, just interrupt and let me know. Can you see the screen at the moment?
Yes.
Yes.
So first of all, let me just tell you that acknowledge my two co-authors, Neeraj Deshmukh and Santanu Pramanik. This is a work we have been doing for a while. And in fact, you are the first people to see any data which is as recent. The last data collection that happened was on May 11th of this month. So, it's like hot off the press. And I'll kind of tell you a little bit about what the data I'm going to present as we sort of go along. Okay. Before anything else, though, let me just tell you, many of you live in Delhi National Capital Region, and this graph sort of pretty much tells you the contours of what has been going on. We basically think that maybe we don't see as, essentially, the testing rate has been more or less stable throughout since January onwards. But the number of cases which became COVID positive has really increased. So as you can see here, it basically really went up and it's now slightly coming down. Okay, so much of the sort of the second surge of COVID in Delhi area was pretty much around April. Okay, so our data are just beginning to capture it. It may take a little while for some of these effects to show up more clearly. So when I started this work, we had 4 research questions. First, we just wanted to understand what's the magnitude of changes in overall employment during the course of the pandemic. Then we wanted to see whether the employment effects of the lockdown varied by gender and whether there are specific types of employment that were more vulnerable to shutdown effects. And the other thing we wanted to look at was whether there was an interaction between lockdown, employment status, and the other forms of vulnerability that we know are relevant in the current state of political economy in India. So these are sort of the 4 things that I'll try to talk about at the moment. But I do want to give you a little bit of a background on where this research began. This research began in actually a year before the pandemic, with a focus on measuring gender and women's work. Okay. Essentially, I think that one concern that I have had is that there has been steady trend in the decline in female labor force participation as captured by the India's national statistics, such as the National Sample Surveys and its follow-on periodic labor force survey. And, they may well be correct. It's just that it's a little bit hard to believe, because if for a demographer, if we think about it, any change in 5 or 7 years, really majority of the people who are surviving today or are of working age today were also working age 5 years ago. Okay. So really what it means is that if we see this sharp decline in labor force that India has recorded, going from almost 40% to 24% labor force participation rate between 2011-12, that seems a little hard to believe. And we were wondering if it might be associated with measurement issues, and could we improve the measurement of women's work to be sure that what we are seeing is actually real and not an artifact of measurement. So that's how we sort of started this work. And then basically once the pandemic struck, we continued it to try to understand, how the pandemic affected women's work, men's work, gender differences in work, and so on. So let me give you a little bit of a background on where I came from, which is basically what do past crises and gendered impact literature tells us. When Asian economic crisis hit in 1997, it generated greater decline in women's employment in South Korea. But in Indonesia, women actually increased their work hours to make up for male unemployment. Okay. In the US and the West, the Great Recession of 2008, manufacturing jobs were harder hit than service sector jobs. So men were more affected than women. Although there is some evidence that some groups of women faced much greater unemployment than others, such as racial and ethnic minorities. Okay. However, it's possible that unlike the prior recessions, COVID-related recession may disproportionately affect women's employment, since women are less likely to be employed in technologically advanced jobs that allowed for telecommuting. So I think you heard from Ashwini Deshpande, or you might be hearing from her, who found that she used some data from Center for Monitoring Indian Economy and found that conditional of being employed in the prior wave, women in India were more likely to be unemployed than men during the COVID-related lockdown about a year ago. So basically what we decided that, in order to understand the unemployment and employment during lockdown, it's very hard to get the data, right? I mean, any of us who were doing face-to-face surveys basically were unable to do it. In any case, it was very hard to get data on women's employment. For example, the CMI statistics show very low work rate participation rates for women, even before the pandemic. Even before pandemic, what they showed was a female work participation rate of about 11% as opposed to 24%, which was shown by other national surveys. Okay. So the other issue is that women's work tends to be much more seasonal in nature than men's work. Okay. So we may need to take into account seasonality as we think about the lockdown impact. So what we did was we started looking at the data we were already collecting. It's called the Delhi Metropolitan Area Study undertaken by NCER. And what we wanted to do when we started that work, we actually were trying to do an experiment to improve measurement of women's work. So the data is only collected in the urban and rural areas surrounding Delhi. Rural areas surrounding Delhi, actually, the Delhi NCR region goes as far away as 200 kilometers, including districts of Bharatpur and Alwar and Sonipat and Meerut and so on. Okay. So we have both urban and rural data. When we started at the baseline, the households were interviewed in face-to-face interview, okay, where basic data on work participation was collected using an NSSI style question, which is, what is your primary activity status? And then for people who say, they're housewives or students or anything else, what is your secondary activity status? And you combine it to give you sort of a combination variable on people's work participation. So what we thought we would do is we would use a more detailed module in which we asked each household if they had a family farm. If they answered yes, we would say who worked on it. Then we asked, whether your household has any kind of a small or large business. And if they say yes, then we would find out who worked on it. Okay. And I think our assumption was that the way the questions are worded influences what is counted as work and who is seen as a worker. Some years ago, when I was doing some field work, I remember going to a village and passing one of these small cigarette and pan shop. And there was a woman sitting there selling stuff. She was also selling some small, grocery items and so on. And we would go day by day past this particular shop, and she was always sitting there. Turned out that her household became part of our sample. And when we started doing data on collecting data on employment status, she said, well, I'm not employed, I'm a housewife. Okay. And so I was asking her, but I see you sitting in this shop every day. Why do you say you're a housewife? She said, oh, my husband owns the shop. It's his shop. I'm just helping out. Okay. Yes. So why is the husband not sitting in the shop? Well, he's a teacher in the nearby town. He works there all day, and then he'll come in the evening, and then he will take over the shop. Okay. If that is the case, she should be counted as a worker. But in her mind, she was not a worker. She was a helper. Okay. So that's one of the reasons we decided that we will have a sort of a different way of asking questions. And that's what you are going to be hearing about. So if you were doing a normal analysis of NSS type data, which is what we call status-based questions, you would ask question about, what was your primary activity status over the past 12 months? And then we would ask people who are involved in domestic duties, was there any other activity that you engaged in for a period of at least 30 days? So we first asked that kind of a question to all our respondents. And then we ask questions about, does your family have a farm? Did you work on family farm? Did you take care of livestock, etc.? And asking it in that form was not sort of a kind of elicited answers that were very different. And as you can see here, for the same households, okay, we managed to capture about 5 percentage point higher work participation rate for women based on this activity listing as opposed to status listing. And this proportion went up substantially once we included taking care of animals. So that's the data we are using. Following the first face-to-face survey, we selected one randomly selected man and one female aged 20 to 60, and we interviewed them every month via telephone. Okay, we had a very short, less than 5-minute interview to ask about work done in the preceding 30 days. And our goal really was to track seasonality and fragmentation of men's and women's work. These surveys began in March of 2019 and would have ended in March of 2020. We took a short break right after the pandemic and the lockdown, but then we decided to restart it. And that particular work has been continued since then, with a sample size of roughly about 1,100 men and 1,100 women. Sometimes people, we can't reach them a particular month and they might not have answers for that month, but then we sort of pick them up the following month and so on. This is just the raw data from work participation rate. And what you can see is, I just want to point out this couple of anomalies to you. Because we started our field work with the rural area, the first couple of months of the data collection was very much rural. So rural women always have higher labor force participation rate than urban. So this is not really a drop, it's just a compositional effect. But if you go after that, you see that it's a pretty stable work participation rate for men. For women, a little bit up and down, but more or less stable. However, there was a very sharp drop in our April interviews, which would cover the preceding 30-day period. Okay? And we saw a substantial decline in labor force participation for both men and for women. For men, as you can see, the drop is larger because they also started from a higher base. Okay? And then what is interesting is that there was a recovery. There was a pickup that happened during November, December, etc. for 2020, early 21. And then again, we see a drop over the last 1 month. Okay? This drop for men is somewhat lower than the drop during the first lockdown. So what I'm going to do is, when I sort of talk to you with multivariate analysis, I'm going to divide up my data in 4 categories. The first is the period before the first lockdown. Okay, that is the pre-pandemic period. Then it's sort of the period between April and June of 2020, which is the first lockdown. Between July and March of 2021 is the recovery period. And the last 1.5 months is the second lockdown. Okay? So those are the sort of the differences that we will be looking at. I caution you for anything I present that the sample size I'm talking about is not huge. 1,100 men, 1,100 women, it's a relatively small sample. And so we need to be a bit cautious. It's also located in Delhi, National Capital Region. But that I don't apologize for, because I think that Delhi NCR actually has been struck very heavily by the pandemic. So if I had to pick one area to sort of look at, this was probably a good area to look at. This is just the very basic descriptive statistics for you. The same numbers that I was presenting in the graph form, now aggregated at a quarterly level. Okay. And what you see is the following. When we take any work, whether it's wage work, self-employment, working on family farm, in own business, etc., about 86% of the sample was working pre-COVID. Of that, only 62% continue to work during the first lockdown. During the recovery for men, the work participation rate increased to 83%. Again, the lockdown too, there has been some decline, but a relatively small decline. And this is because I'm combining both April and May here, where April also covers some of the data from the previous month because we asked them for the previous 30 days. For women, we see a similar kind of a pattern, much lower work participation rate to begin with. But from that, you see a decline down to a 38% to 27% during the first lockdown. It kind of pushes back onto 38% during recovery, and then there is again a slight decline. This is kind of the big picture, okay? That big picture, however, combines some very interesting sub-trends, which is what we would want to look at. First, the big drop really happened for people who were wage workers. Now, the wage workers could be people who have a salaried job in government. They could be a driver in somebody's house. It could be a daily wage laborer. Okay, all of those combined, however, the big drop that happened during the pandemic for men, about 50% of the men were working as wage laborers, and they fell down to 32%. during the recovery, they did not fully go back up to the previous level. Some of the jobs were lost and they were just lost. Okay. So the wage work sort of, instead of going back to 50%, they sort of went up to 45%. The self-employment increased slightly, okay, because a lot of people who got pushed out of a wage job then opened up, some tiny business like, cycle rickshaw, selling vegetables, things of small jobs or small businesses, which kind of absorbed them when they got pushed out of wage work. Okay, and those actually sort of continued. Okay, during the second lockdown, the wage work fell again a little bit because jobs were closed, people were finding it hard to get out. A lockdown has had an impact. Okay, but the self-employment has basically not been affected much at all. For women, you see a similar pattern, but they start with a much lower base. Okay, whereas men, you see half and half wage work and self-employment. For women, only 1/3 women were in the wage employment even to begin with. Okay. And they went down, from 13% to 8%. The recovery was slow. Only about 10% were continue to do wage work during the recovery period. Okay, and that's basically where it stayed. So now to come back to multivariate analysis, because we are combining here both the urban and the rural areas, and women of different ages, different education level, etc. So what I'm going to present you is the results from a monthly probability of being employed with individual specific random effects, and controlling for the calendar month of interview, because calendar month has a big impact on seasonality of employment. And then a variable that reflects the lockdown, various stages of lockdown, okay, and a number of individual specific control variables which contain both individual and household characteristics. So what are the control variables? Age, education, household wealth or asset ownership in quintiles, which was collected in the pre-pandemic first baseline interview. So, we are not looking at the impact of pandemic on the economic status, rather economic status comes from a prior period. State of residence, and we have 4 states here, Haryana, Delhi, Rajasthan, and UP. Whether the person resided in urban area, religion, caste and tribe, and because our samples are very small, we only distinguish between Muslims and non-Muslims and scheduled caste, scheduled tribe combined, and others, and calendar month of interview, okay, which is meant to capture the seasonality. I'm going to, I'll spend a little time over this table because I'm going to present 3 such slides that look analogous for different type of work. Okay, the first one has as a dependent variable in random effects model, whether the individual undertook any work at all or not. It combines both self-employment and wage employment. Okay. Later on, I'll tell you about the self-employment and wage employment separately. These are basically the primary coefficients that are of interest to us. Okay. Drop in men's work participation rate during lockdown 1, with the pre-pandemic period as being the baseline or the reference category. Okay. There was a sharp decline, as you can see, between the pre-pandemic period and lockdown 1. During the recovery period, we still see a slight negative effect, because it shows you that there was still some impact of the recovery wasn't full. There was still some impact, but the difference is not statistically significant. So we could say that, more or less there was a full recovery. Okay. And the lockdown 2, which was just the period of April and May of this month, and very few observations because of that. there is a negative impact, but that negative impact is not nearly as large as the lockdown 1 coefficient. And depending upon, and it's sort of standard error does suggest that it's statistically significant, but it's not as large as the previous lockdown. Now, this is sort of the marginals or the predicted probabilities, keeping all other variables at their mean value. I find these much easier to read and sort of interpret. And what it shows you is again the same thing. The predicted probability before lockdown of employment was 88 or 88%. Predicted probability during the lockdown was 0.61. Recovery, it was 0.84. And during the second lockdown, it's fallen down to 0.79. For women, we also see something similar. We see that the coefficient for women is a little bit smaller than that for the men. Women start from a lower base, okay? But more or less, these differences by gender in overall work participation during the first lockdown were not statistically significant. For women, we see a similar pattern before the first pre-pandemic. Predicted probability was 0.34. During the first lockdown, it was 0.22. During recovery, it was 0.33. And during the second lockdown, it is 0.28. So again, the first lockdown effects were much sharper than the second lockdown effect, with the recovery coming in between. Gender differences basically, and this is just a repeat of what I was talking about earlier, just put down as in a graph form, making it a little easier for you to read. Okay. What we see is that for men started from a higher base, and hence there were more male jobs lost than the female jobs lost. Okay. But if you look at the proportion of the people who were employed and then drop in their employment probabilities, we find that male declines in the first lockdown are about 30%. For female lockdown, declines are about 33%, and the difference is not statistically significant. But the second lockdown is a different story. Okay? With the second lockdown, male employment has been affected much less than female employment as a proportion. And I think some of it may be that over time, people have kind of figured out how to handle lockdowns. This lockdown has not been so abrupt, so sharp that people couldn't continue to work. So men found some ways of working. Women, on the other hand, have had to deal with a variety of other issues, and that has not really made it much easier for them to sort of jump back into the work mode in the same fashion as it has been for men. And you'll see this a little bit when I sort of differentiate between wage employment and self-employment. Okay, this is the same table, same kind of a table as you saw before for wage work. And again, I should emphasize that because of the small sample sizes, I have to combine all kinds of wage work, which is people who have a salaried job in an office as well as casual laborers. And what we find is the following, that the drop in the wage employment was much sharper than for overall work. For men during the first lockdown, it's almost, 45% or so. Okay. In the recovery period, male predicted probability increased, but it never caught up to the previous level of 0.46. It still remained a little bit low. Okay. And during the second lockdown, there has been a decline from 0.4 to 0.34, but it's much smaller than the prior decline, which was from 0.46 to 0.28. So wage work has fallen in both lockdowns. The recovery has not been sort of as robust as one would like. Okay, but the second lockdown impacts are a little bit smaller. For women, first of all, you have to remember that women start from a very low base on the wage work. And during the first lockdown, it just fell really sharply from 0.13 to 0.05, almost non-employment for women at that point. There was some recovery, but the recovery was not complete again. Okay, and there has been again similar precipitous fall during the second lockdown. So during the second lockdown, the wage work probability for women is about the same as the first lockdown. Here, it's important for us to remember what wage work implies. It implies basically either going to get out of your village or neighborhood, or even within the village and neighborhood, having to go away from home and work farther out. Given that schools have been closed and most women have had to take care of their children, wage work has been much more affected than the self-employment work. So this is the data on self-employment. Okay. And what we find is that self-employment was, in self-employment, I'm combining both work on little small businesses as well as on a family farm. Okay. And what we found was that basically there was a drop during the first lockdown in self-employment, but not as great for men as it was for the wage work. And during the recovery, actually more men started doing self-employment than they used to in pre-COVID era, just because job losses kind of forced them into working in either the family farm or on startup small business. When they started working return to family farm, one of the things we have heard anecdotally has been that where household members who were sort of working in nearby towns in wage jobs lost their job, they started working on their family farms, and they pushed out the casual laborers, agricultural laborers who were working on the family farm. So it kind of led to cascading the reduction in the wage labor for various people. During the second lockdown, we see some decline, but not huge. Okay. For women, we see the same sort of a pattern. So in some ways, both men and women experience very similar declines in their employment in their respective sectors. However, because women are far more likely to be concentrated in self-employment than in wage employment, there was some protection offered to women simply because of the sector of work. This is very similar to the story we were talking about earlier on the post-2008 crisis in the US and Western countries, where manufacturing jobs were affected, which disproportionately affected men. Okay. So talking about employment and employment changes without taking into account sort of the sector in which people work and how these sectors are differentially affected doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay. More interesting stories are actually around the rural and urban differences. Okay. And what we basically find is that the rural areas, interestingly, throughout the crisis, okay, in spite of the some dip, have been relatively robust. Okay. Largely because first, the pandemic spread into cities much more than in rural areas. Second, if you are working on your own family farm, you have a much greater control than if your employer shuts the doors. Okay, so the rural families, men and women, were much less affected than urban families, where you see this sharp drop during the first lockdown for the urban men. And we also see some decline during the second lockdown. Okay. When it comes to women, we see a similar impact, although for women, they start from a lower base. So the magnitude of the bars and the differences you see are sort of smaller in size. But again, the same kind of a thing. First lockdown, bigger impacts, second lockdown, in general, smaller impacts, bigger impacts for urban areas than for rural areas. Okay. Now, looking at household asset quintile. Again, I'm presenting data from the same regression, just predicting the interactions between household asset quintile and different phases of lockdown, separately for men and women. And what we see here is a very interesting story. Okay. First of all, even before lockdown, the poorest quintile had fewer men who were employed, okay, which is not surprising. After all, just think about it this way. If you have a household where somebody is sick, unemployed, you're likely to be in the lower income category and hence have lower assets. Okay, so they were sort of in the lower employment category, even to begin with, previous to the lockdown. Once the first lockdown was announced, only about 50% of men in the poorest quintile were employed, as opposed to 67% of the men in the richest quintile. Okay. And this is a combination of two effects. First, to begin with, there was a lower employment, and second, there was sort of this harsh impact of the lockdown. Okay. So vulnerability in some ways was much more among the poorest group than among the richest group. Richest group, one thing also to remember is that the Delhi NCR region also has a lot of government employees, and the government basically, even during lockdown, kept paying people. Okay, so there was some protection for the most well-off households in this area for men. We also see a similar pattern for women, just at a lower base, and there's not much. There's not a whole lot of story to tell here. Okay, this is by different education categories, with the education divided up into no education, 1 to 5 years of education, and 12 plus at the top. Okay, and what you see here is that during the first lockdown, it's the sort of people with middle level of education that were the most affected. The lowest education were often sort of farmers and farm workers, and they were less affected than people who were doing sort of other kind of wage work. The highest educated men were not affected nearly as much because they could either telecommute or they were in jobs which sort of continued even during the lockdown. You could work from home or not work and still get paid. Okay. For women, the pattern is very different. And this is, I want to tell this story, but I also want to kind of caution you that we are talking about very tiny samples here. So this is something, I wonder, someone spoke earlier who said that they were doing work on labor force participation with Himanshu. Okay, this is the kind of stuff you guys should be looking at, with a larger data set. Okay, so what we find is that highest educated men have been kind of protected through the lockdown, whereas highest educated women, the employment probability fell sharply and it never recovered. Okay, part of it, I think, is because these are the women who have been burdened with childcare duties while schools have been closed. Okay, and even during the recovery, they never could go back to work because the schools weren't open yet. Okay. So this is sort of the group that we kind of want to think about going forward. Both from policy perspective, from validating it with a larger data set and so on. So what have I identified so far? I've identified that basically there is the difference between men and women often comes from the sector in which men and women are employed. The poorest were the most likely to be hit during the pandemic because to begin with, they didn't always have a job, and during the pandemic, they lost their jobs. And urban areas were far more affected than rural areas. And highly educated women were much more affected than highly educated men. And I would attribute it to some of the domestic and childcare responsibilities for teaching their children, supervising the homework while distance learning is going on, and so on. I want to talk two substantive issues have to be thought about here. First, we have had a real mismatch between vulnerability and safety nets. Safety nets in India have historically been very rural focused. Okay? And it makes sense, historically rural areas have been poorer than urban areas, and that's where your safety nets ought to be focused. Except the pandemic sort of upended the vulnerability, and urban areas became much more vulnerable. And safety nets have not been focused on urban areas. See, the thing with the safety nets is that you have to go by the prior registries of some kind. Right? So the farmers were registered because they were getting benefits under PM Kisan Yojana. Okay. The food subsidy was directed much more towards rural areas than towards urban areas. So the rural households had public distribution cards that they could be used to get additional ration. Wherever the government had account numbers of people, such as for National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme or the farm subsidies, they could send money to those accounts. So what ended up happening was that we gave money and subsidies where we could, okay, rather than where it was needed. Okay, and this is a challenge that we'll have to think about. I would also like you to reflect on one thing. There has been a real opposition to building up of social registries in India because of privacy concerns. And there have been restrictions on how Aadhaar, which is the unique ID number, that can be used or not used. But when we see these emergency situations, one wonders whether we should be thinking about building up registries and not worry as much about privacy. At some level, privacy concerns are greater for the upper income people, and the ability to get benefits might be more relevant for the lower income people. But this is a debate that somehow we need to think about. The second thing I sort of want to highlight is that the gender impact seems to be particularly major for upper income women, urban women, and so on, who are much more in the wage labor. So in that sense, sort of the gender impact is also driven by social class and sort of intersectionality that we need to think about as we start thinking about public policies. And the final point I want to make, and this is where I'm going out on a limb, because I think the data I have is inadequate to make that assertion, but we are living in a world we have to make assertions based on very limited data, okay? And that is that whereas the first lockdown was really the economic impact that was very relevant, and hence the safety nets and those issues were relevant, the second lockdown, actually, economic impact may not be as large as much as the health impact. Okay, in the first lockdown, none of us knew people who had been diagnosed with COVID or were suffering from sort of health effects. This lockdown, everybody knows someone or the other who has been affected. So if we match the fact that the health effects are very large and the economic effects may be slightly smaller, perhaps the public policy should be focusing much more on health service availability, vaccination, and other such issues surrounding health, rather than worrying to the same level about the safety nets as we did before. Okay. But as I said, I'm going out on a limb over here, based on very sketchy and marginal data. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing and, open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a really informative session. Just before the Q&A session for all the participants, let me announce, we'll have a 15-20 minutes question answer round, and post that we will have an informal session where we can all interact with Professor Sonalde and with each other and discuss over our research interests. Now, anybody who has a question, they can either raise a hand or put it in the chat box. I'll read it out. We have our first question from Ramya. She had midway pointed out that is there a reason for choosing 1100 for men and women the sample size? Is there any rationale behind it?
You know, there is a rationale, but that rationale doesn't have much to do with the COVID related issue. The rationale basically for us was that when we started this work, it was much more around an experimental design in which we wanted to try out different kind of questions. And so we had a sort of a house survey of 5,000 households, and that we divided up into several different groups, in which one area in which we were piloting the employment questions, the other one where we were piloting some of the health expenditure questions and so on. Okay, so it was much more that we really were seeing this as a pilot of design testing the design of the questionnaire rather than trying to draw generalizable results. And of course, there is always the issue of logistics and how much you can handle.
So we had Anisha was saying something.
Oh, yeah, I have a couple of questions, ma'am. Thank you firstly for such an in-depth analysis of how employment has affected the rural-urban and the male-female workforce. In a recent report which was released by the Azim Premji University, they also did something similar. And we find that in their analysis, it was suggested that it was the women who lost more jobs, which corroborates with the findings of your study. And it implies that it was the younger women who lost more. Like if you take the spread of the women, it was the younger women who lost their jobs and never recovered even after the COVID, after the lockdown, the second lockdown also. So my question is, am I making a conjecture when I'm saying that in your analysis, you said that it was the highly educated women who lost? And also they go saying that it was the younger women who lost. So sort of saying that, okay, the women who were highly educated and were younger have lost not just in NCR, but also across various states when the APU did this study.
You know, it is quite possible. I think that in our case, we actually controlled for age. So, you know, I'm looking at the pure education effect here. Okay. I don't quite remember APU, you know, what is the analytical final tables that they were using, you know, whether what kind of a model they were using. I will look it up. I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, because if we think in terms of cohorts, it's the younger cohorts which have more education, right?
Yes.
So chances are that it's the younger cohort that lost more jobs. Okay, but I do want to make one point very clear. Okay, this male-female difference, we just have to be very careful about how we present and what we present. Okay? If we think about it, suppose 10% of men lost jobs and 10% of women lost jobs. Okay, there were many more men employed. So in terms of sheer job losses, it's the male job losses that dominate the country. Okay, in terms of proportionality, okay, it may be women depending upon how or which area you're sort of looking at. In our case, we find that even proportionally, both men and women have lost similar level of jobs. But for women, if we look at each sector, they have lost more jobs. Okay, within the wage workers, more women have lost jobs. Within the self-employment, more women have lost jobs. It's just that more of the women are in the self-employment. So it's the compositional effect which mutes the gender effect. Okay, so that's just something I guess I'm trying to be very cautious about specifying.
I think I have more questions, but I will take it for the informal discussion. I now invite our other participants to go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, we have Meher has a question.
Yes. Hello, ma'am. So when we're looking at the impact of lockdown on female labor force participation, we can understand that there is an effect of childbearing and other domestic duties on female labor force participation. But then how is it that this effect impacts disproportionately according to the education level?
So I think that there are a number of issues that sort of come in here. And again, I'm quite sort of talking about conjecture rather than, empirical analysis, but that's the kind of a fun thing to also think about. Okay. I think that we are living in a country, and especially cities in areas like Delhi NCR, where we have upper income families have become highly competitive when it comes to their children's education, right? We invest a lot, okay? And when schools are closed and children are sort of having to learn on their own, okay, it's these highly educated women who sort of get very invested in making sure that their children are sort of, getting onto online classes, doing lessons, homework, etc. Whereas for women with less education, those inputs might be harder to come by, and demands of sort of financial demands might dominate. Okay, so we are talking about what Annette Laro had, a very well-known sociologist, has talked about. She called it concerted cultivation. Okay, that you are sort of, you are growing these orchids and you're putting in this enormous amount of emphasis on it, as opposed to dandelions which just grow all over the place. Okay. And again, I'm just now speaking from conjecture, and there is a sort of a tendency to sort of using hyperboles in some of these discussions. Okay. But looking at all my friends around me who are spending this enormous amount of time training their children, I would say it's probably not, overstatement.
Thank you, ma'am. I just have one follow-up query to this. So when we talk about push and pull employment, so is this some sort of a failure of the pull of the females into the employment?
Yes, now that's I would take this as a slightly take it away from the pandemic story. Okay, let's talk about this in general. Okay, in general, if we look at India and not NCR region but nationwide data, okay, that from our India Human Development Survey, what we found was that basically holding husbands and other family income constant. Okay. Women's labor force participation had a U-shaped curve, in that the least educated women were most likely to be employed, and the most educated women were sort of beginning to get employed, but it's the middle range which wasn't. And a lot of it, I think, was because if you had a man with 10th class education, okay, you can be a postman, you can be a truck driver, you can be, auto mechanic repair person. These are not the jobs which are available to women. And so it is basically, in some sense, the push factor which keeps women with this middle level of education away. Okay, but that's sort of a more of a bigger story. Okay, I'm not precisely sure with the pandemic I'm able to make those claims. That might also be true, but I'm not able to make those claims.
Thank you, ma'am. Next, we have Samiksha.
Ma'am, I don't have a question. I just have a clarification. First of all, thank you. This study was very useful. I mean, it can be very useful for my research also. I had a clarification that domestic workers who have included in self-employed or wage workers. And second, are we looking, will the study get published soon? Because I just wanted to know.
Okay, so first, domestic workers are included in wage employed because they get sort of salary wage. Okay. Second, we actually have published a paper which I can put a link to it on the chat box, but it ends at the first lockdown. Okay, this more recent data, the last, I'm actually, I wouldn't be presenting this data if I was presenting it at a much more critical audience than the friendly audience, because the last data set I use is from 11th of May. Okay, and there could always be, who knows what coding error I might have done. Okay, so I don't know when that will get published. but I will put a link in the chat box to the paper from that ended with the first lockdown.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Is it the paper that had come in feminist economics? Right?
Yes, it did.
Yeah, I'll put the link. We have Aarti next.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and collecting this data. It's very interesting. You started talking about designing or putting up social safety nets for urban areas, and this has been a subject of discussion recently. I was wondering if you managed to ask or find out anything more about what was the biggest expenditure burdens or, for example, childcare burdens that might help us understand how to design such a social safety net? Because from my understanding right now, such programs are mostly focused on food distribution, which is not sufficient to keep a household afloat during such a crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we did not. Okay, it was Aarti, right? Question, yeah.
Yes.
We did not. You know, one of the biggest problems is when you're doing telephone surveys. Okay, the amount of data that you can collect is very limited. Okay, this is just out of the short employment module, which is less than 5 minutes that I'm presenting, but it's the same person being interviewed every month. Okay. We also did some other household-based telephone surveys. The last one having happened in June, and if you look at the NCER website, you will see the results from those surveys. But even there, to be honest, see, the problem I think is that the questions that you can ask on a telephone survey are very limited. And we are dealing with a population where phone access, there's a lot of ambient noise in the environment. People's ability to understand what we are asking is not always very clear. Okay. And so I would say we don't have enough data to be able to tell you what are the biggest needs. Okay. I would say one thing. I personally have increasingly begun to believe, okay, that there are basically two types of safety nets that we need to think about. One is a set of safety nets which are designed towards particular population and for particular purposes, such as, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Can you do something along that line for the urban sector, okay, or the PDS food distribution? The second, however, is an emergency aid, okay? Emergency aid is, where you really have no way of knowing when the emergency is going to strike. There is a flood, there is a drought, there is a pandemic, okay? Something happens, you just have no way of knowing it. You do not have time to develop, design or build any kind of a safety net program at that point in time. You just want to get cash out as quickly as you can to these households to provide whatever support you can. So the first set, which are sort of deeper underlying structural issues, okay, I think that we would probably want to figure out, what are the biggest needs, who to address it to, target it to specific populations if we can. Okay. The second one, I think the only targeting you can do is geographic targeting. Okay. You could say that Mathura district has been affected deeply by, there has been a plague that has swept through it, or COVID has swept through it, and we need to get aid out to people in Mathura. Don't worry about the rich or the poor. Just get it out to everybody in Mathura at that point in time. In order to do that, what we do need is geographically designed registries, okay? Which often people tend to call sort of social registries, where you have some information on this person so that you can get the benefits out to them. US offers a very interesting example. Okay, in April, last year's April, they said that they were going to get money, $1,400 to various households. Okay, and everybody was supposed to get it except if your income exceeded a certain very high threshold. The problem was that the government did not have bank numbers of the people to send this money to. Okay, they didn't even know who are the taxpayers and who are the people whom they should be sending money to. So what they did was they basically used the tax database. And most people, if you're getting a tax refund, you've given government your bank account number so that the tax refund can come to your bank account. Okay, so people who had paid their taxes and who had refund coming managed to get the refunds. People who had either not paid the taxes because they were just below the threshold of tax payment, or they were disorganized, or they did not have refund coming, they actually owed money to the government. Okay, all of these people were kind of left out. Okay, so the idea of, if we think about it, how can government get money to people? Okay, in order to do that, there are two things they need. Okay, they need to know who you are, where you live, okay, and your bank account number. Okay, and this is where some sort of a social registry comes into play. And I plead guilty to all the violations that the privacy protection community will sort of direct at me. Okay, but I believe our world has changed during the pandemics and we are thinking differently.